Hi, this is Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons history and whether the greatest crisis in the history of Dungeons & Dragons was the Satanic Panic of 1984 or the release of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons in 2008. All right, let's talk about it. All right, so I'm not going to bury the lead. It is my strong opinion that 4th edition was a greater crisis in the history of Dungeons & Dragons and was a greater threat to the game of Dungeons & Dragons, the health of the game, the success of the game, and the longevity of the game than the Satanic Panic ever was. That the release of 4th edition was a greater crisis in the history of Dungeons & Dragons than the Satanic Panic than the Satanic Panic. So let's talk about it. All right, so one, I just want to say, I'm really getting into the scholarly study of Dungeons & Dragons history. And one of the reasons why is I like tales of exotic locations, epic events, monsters, and heroes. And guess what? I think there are more exotic locations, more epic events, more monsters, and more heroes in the history of Dungeons & Dragons than there is in the lore of Dungeons & Dragons, right? Like, there's a lot that went on in the last 45 years. And if you have the patience to unpack this stuff and really look at the people who are involved, how it interacts with American history, and, you know, just what a huge element of Americana D&D is, how it impacts our politics, our culture, and our society, you are in for some pretty amazing tales, right? Like, it really is incredible, right? So let's get into this. All right, so let me define my terms. So, Satanic Panic, I'm centering that on 1984. The reason why is that's when the D&D, that's when the Dark Dungeons Chick Trap came out. And I think that was pretty much the height of the Satanic Panic. Now, the Satanic Panic absolutely radiates out in both directions for years before 1984 and years after 1984. But that is, you know, that I think 1984 was the center of the Satanic Panic. Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition release happened in 2008, but that product was being built a couple years beforehand, and certainly the impacts of it radiated out a couple years after its release, okay? All right, so both of these, so if there's any question that these were crises in D&D, you better recognize they were absolutely crises in D&D, right? So the Satanic Panic, let me define what that was and why it was a problem. So essentially, in 1984, and a few years before that, a few years after that, Americans, adult Americans, primarily adult parent Americans, got very concerned that Dungeons & Dragons was a Trojan horse, and that within it, it contained serious occult connections, occult content, and specifically a dark connection to Satanism, right? And so, you know, and so essentially, a number of repressive people and powerful people in 1984 really targeted Dungeons & Dragons, and there were books burned, and many parents, literally millions of parents across the nation, at least probably low millions, I would say, really were like, hey, told their kids, hey, you can't play Dungeons & Dragons anymore. Done, right? You know, and so it was a serious issue, and it was a serious threat to the game, all right? In the year 2008, the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons came out. People debate to this day the quality of that game. There's two things that aren't debated. The impact from World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft had come out in the early 2000s. World of Warcraft essentially remapped all of video games forever. It hit like a comet, and it impacted both the Dungeons & Dragons game, and it also impacted video game industry at the macro level, right? So in 2008, 4th edition comes out, and anybody who wants can debate the quality of the game, but nobody can debate that it sundered the community. It took literally like very close to half or even more of the player base, and just sent them packing. And where they packed their bags, and they went right to Paizo and Pathfinder, right? It's a serious, dark time in the history of Dungeons & Dragons, and it was a major threat to the game, all right? Now, why is the release of 4th edition, why was the release of 4th edition a bigger threat to Dungeons & Dragons than the Satanic Panic ever was? Well, I'm going to use a mnemonic to hit my main points here. So thank you for your patience. My mnemonic is Badger allies accept treats. All right, so let's deal with treats. Treats is not treats, it's threats. All right, so what was the threat that existed within the Satanic Panic? Well, it was repressive people, right? People who were like, hey, you know, I want to repress other people's ability to play this game. That got a little sticky because some of those people were kids, right? And, you know, parents really should be monitoring what their kids are doing, right? So from that perspective, it gets a little, you know, a little hairy, right? But overall, one of the issues here was the threat to Dungeons & Dragons, the game, the threat to Dungeons & Dragons owning company, which was TSR at the time, was external to Dungeons & Dragons, okay? It was upset parents who really weren't playing the game and really, frankly, were quite ignorant of the game, okay? It also came from the media, who, again, were shockingly ignorant of the game, right? But it was quite external to Dungeons & Dragons, right? Now, why is that important that the threat from the Satanic Panic was external to the game? Well, one of the reasons is allies. In 1984, when there were a bunch of repressive people pointing the finger at Dungeons & Dragons and getting parents scared, and those parents telling their teenagers and even their college-age students, don't play this game, or you can't play this game, or don't play this game, it got pretty sticky, right? So one of the things that was really interesting was, basically, Dungeons & Dragons actually got allies from external to their industry. Comic books, fiction novels, right? Movies, right? All of these artists, right, rallied behind. There were instances where important people from other industries external, right, to Dungeons & Dragons, who were connected to art and to free speech, were like, oh my gosh, look what they're doing to Dungeons & Dragons. They could do that to us, right? So Dungeons & Dragons actually got some bold allies from the movie industry, from the comic book industry, from the fiction book industry, and actually other industries as well, who were saying, hey, you know, like, you pointing the finger at Dungeons & Dragons is not cool because you don't have evidence for what you're saying, or the connections that you're trying to draw, they are dotted line, they're not solid line, or the line doesn't even exist, right? All right, so that's really important. The threat for the Satanic Panic was external, right? Now, let's talk about 4th edition. That threat was totally internal, right? D&D, the company that owned D&D at the time, is the same company that owns it right now, and it was Hasbro, and they done it to themselves. They done it to themselves. 4th edition was a major problem, right? It really upset a lot of Dungeon Masters. It really upset a lot of players, right? And Hasbro had nobody to blame but itself. These were not external people who were ignorant of the game coming in and pointing fingers at Dungeons & Dragons. These were people who knew Dungeons & Dragons incredibly well. These were DMs who were saying, hey, you done screwed up the game, right? These were players who were like, hey, what the heck, I don't want to run a video, I don't want to play in a video game that's made of paper and pencils and dice, right? I want my old, good, rock-solid, creative, intelligent, adaptive game that I used to have, right? And so the threat to Dungeons & Dragons was coming from its own player base, from its own Dungeon Master base. And guess what? When you done it to yourself, you don't get any allies from external, right? Nobody cares. When you self-injure yourself, you are not going to get a lot of sympathy, right? Like, that's the issue, right? So where Satanic Panic was an external threat on freedom of speech, on creativity, on art itself, right? 4th edition was just an incredibly poorly executed edition from the perspective of it not retaining its own player base. I'm not saying from the rules perspective. I'm actually kind of a fan of 4th edition rules. All right, so with all that said, that is really, really important to remember, okay? What else is evidence that 4th edition was a much greater threat to Dungeons and Dragons than the Satanic Panic ever was. Well, let's talk about acceptance, right? At this point, the Satanic Panic is thoroughly and utterly gone. In fact, it is actually openly mocked and made fun of, right? And the reality is, the Satanic Panic, now people see it as a boogeyman, right? Very much as a boogeyman. It's just, you know, it's no longer, it's just seen as a very brief and short issue, you know, that happened in Dungeons and Dragons history, and the idea that it would happen again is ridiculous. Oh my gosh, I'm a parent, right? I have kids who are in, I have 4 children, right? One's old enough to be in the workforce, fully adult. One's in college, and one's in high school, and one's in junior high, right? And I can tell you right now, the threats that I worry about with my kids, and most parents today, are not them reading, you know, 1,000 pages of books and then going and hanging out with their friends around a table and rolling plastic dice, right? That is the farthest thing in the world I worry about. There are very real, very dramatic problems that the world has. I'm not even going to list them because they're horrific, right? Like, and so let me tell you, your kid playing some kind of game is about the last thing on anybody's list today, right? Like, so the idea that the Satanic Panic could even rear its ugly head again is ludicrous and quite laughable. And frankly, a ton of people really do laugh at the Satanic Panic today. It's really more a source of jokes than a source of fear. Let's talk about 4th edition and the fears that it engenders today, right? Well, what is the real fear around 4th edition? Well, guess what? The fear around 4th edition is, oh my gosh, every new edition of Dungeons and Dragons could ruin the game, and we could lose the game if another fantasy tabletop role-playing game executes well and steps in and steals the player base. Exactly like Paizo did with Pathfinder for 4th edition, right? They published Pathfinder, which is really Dungeons and Dragons 3.75, right? And it was a major problem, right? And guess what? The fright and the scare of 4th edition is incredibly sharp and detailed right now, because we are about to go to 6th edition, and there are massive threats to the game that lurk within the building of 6th edition. So one of the issues right now is, it is my strong opinion that Kate Welch will be the lead design on 6th edition. Kate Welch is super woke, right? And frankly, Dungeons & Dragons player base at the macro level, there are a lot of exceptions to this, but I don't think it's the majority. At the macro level, it would be hard to argue that the Dungeons & Dragons community at the macro level is super woke. They're kind of not. That's purely my opinion. I don't got any guys surveys or facts to back that up, but just take a look at Twitter or especially Reddit. But I think you'll find some evidence that my opinion is quite right on that one. All right, so with that said, you know, I think now I am down for a woke D&D, right? Like I definitely, there's a whole list of things they're going to do, right? Almost certainly the word race is going to disappear completely from Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition. That's a guarantee, right? Like, I would bet $1 to a donut that is going to happen, right? And the reality is there's going to be a whole bunch of other woke content that gets put into Dungeons & Dragons. Now, if they get the mix wrong, right, and the community finds themselves allergic to a super woke Dungeons & Dragons, or, you know, that could be a serious issue, right? So there's absolutely risks that come with 6th edition, right? Now, Kate Welch is super smart. I think, you know, there's like parents like having their kids eat vegetables, right? They blend them up and put them in a shake, right? Maybe Kate Welch is going to figure out a way to do that, right? We'll see. I don't know, right? But the reality is the idea, 4th edition scared every savvy DM and every player to say, if a new edition's coming out, you best recognize there's some risks. Even if you have super dope, super intelligent, super awesome creators like Kate Welch, right? I think Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition is going to be in super awesome hands. I'm a huge fan of Kate Welch. I think she's the best pick to be the design lead for Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition. And I'll tell you right now, I super think she is going to be the lead for Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition. Just look at the credits in the books that have been coming out. I am not wrong on this one, right? So But 4th edition, man, showed that addition shock, right? Addition risk, addition threat is incredibly real, and it will rear its head every time the game is changed to a new edition, right? Whereas the Satanic Panic, that ain't happening again, right? Like, there was some documentary recently that was like, Hail Satan. The whole thing's a joke. Like, nobody, like, the vast majority of people today don't even think Satan's real, right? It is not, you know, the Satanic Panic ain't coming back. But the addition threat, that remains, right? One last reason why I think it is very, very clear that 4th edition was a much greater crisis in the history of Dungeons and Dragons than the Satanic Panic, and that is badge of honor, right? Now, first of all, before I say this, I want to acknowledge there were some people who, you know, the Satanic Panic of 1984, you know, and it radiating out years, you know, forward and backward from 1984, there were some real victims, right? There were some people who really, I think they have literal and emotional and, you know, they have literal and figurative scars from that time, right? There was some bad stuff that happened. There were some people who had some really repressive people they were attached to, and they have some true horror stories, right? Like, that is real. I acknowledge that, right? But I think for many, many people, this was an issue of them, you know, where their parents were like, I saw something on 60 Minutes, and now you can't play Dungeons and Dragons, right? But the rest of their lives are pretty okay, and even that wasn't that much of a problem. Like, I've heard some crazy stories. I heard people took their D&D books, rebound them into textbooks, like into like school textbooks, you know, and they'd be like, I'm going over to home, you know, I'm going over with my friends to do homework, and hold up their algebra book, which was actually their player's handbook, you know what I mean? Like, I've heard some really crazy stories. And actually, so this second group of people who the Satanic Panic was really more an annoyance than anything else, for them, it has become a super dope badge of honor, right? And they get to say, oh, yes, my repressive parents told me I couldn't play Dungeons and Dragons, and I had to hide it, you know, I had to hide it for years, and we wrote our character sheets in code, and we passed notes to each other in church when we were actually playing, you know, they have a million really cool, awesome stories about how they got around the Satanic Panic, right? Now, not taking away people who actually suffered during that time, I definitely recognize it, but for many people, it was an annoyance, and now it's a super cool badge of honor, right? Now, get this. Ain't nobody wearing their Days as 4th edition as a badge of honor, right? Like, you know, like, and the other thing is, even like these people who had, you know, kind of an annoyance through the Satanic Panic, they talk about, like, it's almost like they miss the persecution. They're like, remember the days when playing D&D was super cool and countercultural, and the Guardian wasn't saying we were cool, right? Like, and we weren't super mainstream, and shiny actors didn't start their own D&D shows, right? Like, remember when we were countercultural? You know, like, it was a thing, right? Like, it really, like, Satanic Panic has, you know, people who didn't suffer but were annoyed by it, they really wear it as a badge of honor now. Absolutely no one wears 4th edition days as a badge of honor. Nobody's like, I and my friends, we really liked 4th edition, and we were told by 3rd edition players that it was a bad game, but we persisted. You know, like, that story ain't getting any, like, you don't get any likes on Twitter with that story, trust me, right? Like, it is not. So 4th edition, you know, and I played 4th edition. I played a 4th edition at a local game shop close to me. One of my very, very best friends now came from my play in 4th edition, and it was a real thing. I really dug it, and I had a really good time. But I'm telling you right now, no one is carrying their 4th edition play period as a badge of honor, right? So that, you know, the addition threat, the internal, external threat, nature of the threat, the allies that the Satanic Panic caused, and the badge of honor that it has become for many, I think, are all good, solid evidence and proof that 4th edition release in 2008 was a much greater crisis in the history of Dungeons & Dragons than the Satanic Panic of 1984 ever was. All that's my opinion. How about you? What do you think? Which one of those do you think was a greater crisis? Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.